Hi everybody, Jacob Reed here from ReviewEcon.com. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2022 Macroeconomics Set 2, the FRQs. I have not seen these questions before today. I don't know what the answer rubrics are going to say, but these are my best guesses of what the answers are going to be based on the past questions they've had before and my knowledge of macroeconomics. So let's jump into the questions. Let me know if you agree with my answers. Just put in the comments. If you want to ask me some questions, do that. There we go. Let's jump into it. So first question, we are going to assume that the United States economy is in short run macroeconomic equilibrium and that the output level is greater than potential output. That means we have an inflationary gap. We're going to draw an ASAD model using the labels they tell us to label on that graph. So here we go. We have our YF below our long run aggregate supply curve, and our current equilibrium labeled Y1 and PL1 is greater than that full employment output. There we go. So there's our first part. Moving on to part B, we're going to assume that the government increases spending by $100 billion. We're going to show the impact on that graph we just drew. So an increase in government spending is actually going to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right, making that inflationary gap larger. I hope you didn't get tricked. Yeah, the government's action is actually making the inflationary gap bigger or worse, and so it was not closing the gap as maybe you might have thought it should. So here we go. Moving on to C. We're going to assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. As a result of that government spending, what is the numerical value of the maximum change in the following in the short run? Real GDP, first of all, we're going to take 1 divided by 0.2, which is 1 minus the MPS, 1 minus the MPC that we have there of 0.8. That gives us a spending multiplier of 5. And so real GDP is going to increase by up to 5 times that $100 billion increase in government spending of $500 billion. All right. Next, we're going to figure out the change in household savings. Remember, 20% of money is constantly being saved. What is 20% of that new real GDP increase of $500 billion? Well, there you go. It's also the amount of that government spending. Remember, it keeps getting spent and portions are saved. Portions are spent, portions are saved. Well, that keeps going until the whole amount has been saved. And so really it's $100 billion. So $500 billion increase in real GDP, 20% of that is the savings amount. It's also the end of the multiplier essentially, right? So $100 billion increase in household savings. Next, we're going to draw a money market graph and show the impact of the real output change that we identified in CI. So we have an increase in real GDP, and remember, real GDP and the price level, those two things combined are the transaction demand for money. So we saw an increase in the transaction demand for money there, shift that money demand curve to the right, and increase the nominal interest rate. For part E, based on that change of the nominal interest rate, what will happen to prices of previously issued bonds? Interest rate went up. That means the price of bonds is going to go down. There's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. Hopefully you figured that out. All right. Next over to F. If the United States and the European Union are trading partners with flexible exchange rates, so what's going on? So we have a change in the inflation rate. So U.S. inflation increases essentially compared to the European inflation rate. What's going to happen to the demand for the dollar? And explain. We're going to see a decrease in the demand for the dollar, and that's because our higher inflation rate means that the U.S. our exports will be more expensive to people in Europe, and our exports will decrease, which decreases the demand for the dollar, causing the exchange rate to decrease or make the currency depreciate. For the next part, what's going to happen to the international value of the dollar? Well, there you go. I just said it actually. It's going to depreciate, and that's because the demand for dollars has decreased. On to G, we're going to suppose that the Federal Reserve attempts to keep the value of the dollar constant. How can they do that? Now, the class doesn't really have a lot of stuff about currency manipulation, but the Federal Reserve, they've got euros, they've got dollars, they've got lots of foreign currencies, and if they want to keep the currency, the value the same, they can buy and sell or supply and demand the currencies that they've got or want and change the value of, in this case, the dollar. So in this case, they can sell or supply the euro, or they can buy the dollar, and that will again change those exchange rates. So, and both of those would cause the currency to go back to where it was, the value of the currency go back to where it was. All right, next up to number 2. The table here, we have a bunch of information about our GDP, and we're going to calculate the real GDP first of all for 2021. So we have nominal GDP there of 88,000, and we have a GDP deflator of 200. In order to find real, you're going to take the nominal, divide it by the GDP deflator, then times 100, and that will give us, for that first one for I, $44,000 worth of real GDP. If we want to take per capita GDP now, we're going to divide it by the population, and the population there is 110, and that gives us $400 worth of per capita real GDP in 2021. On to B, based solely on that data provided, what has the standard of living for the average person in that country increased, decreased, or stayed the same? If you do the math for 2020, you will see that the per capita real GDP is also $400. And so as a result, that means it stayed the same. And that's because per capita real GDP was $400 for both 2020 and 2021. On to C, would an increase in the government spending on education affect economic growth in country A? Explain. So this is a basic, simple concept in economics. Educated workers are better, more productive workers. And the reason why, I put increase, and it's because educational funding would increase human capital, and with that, worker productivity. That would increase long-run potential, real output, shifting that long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Whenever I do my explanations, I try to connect it to math or graph whenever possible, so that LRAS shifting to the right is my graph connection there. I'm not 100% sure whether or not it'll be required, but it's always good to make those connections wherever possible. For D, we're going to assume that country A produces consumer goods and capital goods, and draw a correctly labeled production possibilities graph for country A and show the effect of the increase in government spending on education on your graph. And so what's it going to do? Well, we just said that it's going to increase economic growth. And so there we go, economic growth, shift that production possibilities curve outward because more educated workers are better and more productive workers, thanks to increases in human capital, which again are skills and knowledge, if you didn't remember that. All right. So number 3, we're going to we have the country Zeta, and it's at long-run equilibrium. However, the government is currently concerned about the size of the national debt. We're going to identify one fiscal policy action that it could take to reduce that national debt. Well, again, we're not looking at monetary policy here. This is fiscal policy. They can increase taxes, which would mean less national debt, or they could decrease government spending. Either one of those answers will be acceptable. Nothing about monetary policy, though, will get you a point here. For B, we're going to draw a correctly labeled graph of that loanable funds market and show the impact of the fiscal policy action we just identified and show the impact on that real interest rate. Since the government's going to be borrowing less money, we are going to see the opposite of crowding out. There we go. We see an increase in the supply of loanable funds, or the more common answer is a decrease in the demand for loanable funds. Either of those shifts are going to get you the point. It depends on your method of how you graph crowding out. So less government borrowing, though, is essentially going to lower that real interest rate. All right. For C, based on that real interest rate change that we just saw, what's going to happen to aggregate demand in the short run? And explain. Well, that change in the interest rate we just saw is going to impact the gross investment. So we're going to see an increase in aggregate demand, and that's because the lower interest rate will increase gross investment and interest rate sensitive spending. But gross investment is the focus here. For the next part, what's going to happen to potential real GDP? Again, we're going to explain, and we just talked about gross investment increasing, and that's going to mean that we have an increase in potential GDP because increases in gross investment increase the physical capital stock, and that shifts that long-run aggregate supply curve to the right. As a result, we get more economic growth. And that's it. That's all we got. So, Let me know what you think about these answers. I hope they're right. I don't know for sure. Best of luck to everybody when the scores come out in July, and let your friends know about reviewecon.com so that hopefully they can do just as well as you did, or maybe even better. Who knows? All right. Thank you very much for watching this year. Good luck. Take care.